You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm a video producer, Osman Butt. My guest today is Kevin Jones. Kevin is an associate professor and director of undergraduate studies in the history department at the University of Georgia. He earned his PhD in history from the University of Michigan in 2013 and served as Post-Doctoral Research Fellow at George Washington University's Institute for Middle East Studies in 2013 to 2014, before accepting his current position at the University of Georgia. He has published 2 articles about Iraqi cultural history and Middle Eastern labor history in Social History. His first book, The Dangers of Poetry, Culture, Politics, and Modernity in Iraq, was published by Stanford University Press in September 2020. The book demonstrates the unique contribution of nationalist and communist poets to the cultural politics of anti-colonial and national liberation in 20th century Iraq. Kevin, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it's our pleasure to have you. I suppose the first question is kind of obvious. You decided to obviously go and study poetry, and specifically you were drawn to radical Iraqi poetry, as your book shows. So could I ask, what drew you to all of this?
Yes, it was, I was drawn to poetry, I would say, in a fairly roundabout fashion. I was initially drawn to Iraq and to Iraqi history without necessarily having any interest in poetry. I was drawn to Iraq in part because the U.S. invasion began when I was an undergraduate, and I was involved in some anti-war activism. And then when I started my PhD, I knew I wanted to work on Iraq. This was obviously more than a decade and a half ago. And I ran into the dilemma of how someone in the US can write about the history of Iraq in the mid to late 2000s, with the obstacles that we would face at that time with respect to sources, right? Because the security situation was not conducive to conducting research. The archives in Iraq were looted during the U.S. occupation, so it's unclear that there would have been sources there anyway. And so the question is, how can you do the history of Iraq without just relying on the British archives or the U.S. archives? How can you take Iraqi voices into consideration? And so, I spent some time trying to think that through. How could I do this? And I started reading a lot of Iraqi memoirs to sort of get a sense of whether I would find perspectives there that were significantly different than what you'd find in the British archives. And I was struck over and over again by how much Iraqi writers talked about poets and poetry in their memoirs and the reflections of life in the early 20th century, mid 20th century in Iraq. So I began looking more into poetry, and I always remember going into the stacks at the library at the American University in Cairo and finding a slim volume written by an Iraqi critic in Arabic called something like the Poetry and the 1920 Revolution in Iraq. And I read through the book, and it was this great collection of all of these poems that came out of this revolutionary moment. And it was all of these Iraqi perspectives that have been recorded and sort of memorialized that you don't find anywhere else. And it's it was this beautiful snapshot of what people were talking about, certainly what poets were writing about, but also what the words that they were speaking in mosques and political rallies. To me, it was just an amazing historical source that offered a kind of window or vantage point into a particular aspect of Iraqi history.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because obviously, poetry is quite big in the Middle East generally. I mean, even today, right, you've got, when you think about popular, shows on television, in the West, we obviously have musical shows, people doing singing contests, and you have that in the Arab world. But you also have popular poetry shows, and Iraq in particular has a very long tradition of poetry. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what is the Iraqi tradition of poetry and its social significance.
Yes, right. Certainly, poetry, I would argue, is the dominant cultural form and has been for a long time in the Middle East as a whole, but in Iraq more generally. And it's a question that I often get from other historians working outside the Middle East in the U.S. And they're like, so what's so important about poetry in Iraq, or what's the comparison? What can we compare it to? And a repeated suggestion is, is it like say hip hop in contemporary America, where it's a cultural form that's genuinely popular and has kind of some expression of mass desires. And it's always, I don't think that there is a perfect comparison to various cultural mediums in the West, because I mean, in kind of cultural historians in the West often draw this distinction between high culture and mass culture, right? The cultural forms of the elite, whether that's classical music, novels, opera, etc., and then mass culture, which would be, popular songs, television in some cases, things that really speak to broad kind of social classes. And in my view, the really unique facet of poetry in Iraq is that the high culture, mass cultural divide is not relevant here, right? Because this is a literary and cultural form that on the one hand is kind of the pinnacle of high culture, right? I mean, the poets in the late Ottoman period in Iraq were being given seats in the Senate. Even later in the Hashemite monarchy, some of the prominent poets are given seats in parliament, right? So it's a kind of the recognition of a great poet is like, you're recognized as kind of man of the state, right? You have a very high position in society. On the other hand, it's not just high culture. It's not just a cultural form that only speaks to the elite, to a sort of very highly educated, literate audience, because poetry was an oral phenomenon. You don't need to be literate to understand and to enjoy it. The kind of rhythmic and metric structures of poetry mean that it can be easily memorized and related from one person to the next, so it travels well. And in Iraq in particular, there was I've got all these anecdotes and stories of prominent famous poets sort of idolized for their brilliance in neoclassical poetry, which sounds like high culture, but they're giving these poetry readings in big public demonstrations, and there's communist workers and peasants who are out there cheering and listening to every word, right? So it's a kind of cultural phenomenon that straddles every aspect of society.
It's quite interesting because when we talk about the distinction between high and low cultures, this is a very post-Enlightenment phenomenon we see in Europe, and I think there's this sort of expectation that every other culture must have had something similar.
Exactly, right. And it's it's right. It becomes difficult to there's a tendency among all historians or academics, no matter what part of the world you're working with, to sort of to theorize everything, and you draw on the sort of canonical theorist, and the cultural historians would look a lot to the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who's written about the organic intellectual and very sort of cultural war of positioning and whatnot. And as influential and powerful as these theories are for understanding cultural phenomena in Western Europe, in the US, and elsewhere, they're just not completely satisfying, right? It's impossible, I think, in some ways, to impose that kind of theoretical framework that's drawn from a perspective of culture in the West and impose it on other contexts.
There's an interesting question here would be then, since we're not obviously drawing on these theorists to understand this phenomenon, I'm sort of beginning to wonder, how does Iraqi poetry or Iraqi poets understand themselves and their own significance?
That's a great question. I mean, I think I would say for sure that the prominent poets of the kind of early 20th century period definitely saw themselves as spokesmen of the nation, right? They weren't, there's a tremendous social responsibility as they saw it in the poetry that they're writing. And I get into this to some extent in the first chapter of the book, where there's in the late Ottoman period, there's a big move of some of the prominent poets to write about new technological developments, new scientific ideas and discoveries. And it's not really satisfying to me from an aesthetic perspective to read these poems. They're not particularly beautiful, but there's, it's kind of a didactic poem that's here to like, I'm going to tell my audience about the train, right? How the train moves, like, so they understand. So there's a sense that they see their job is to educate the people listening to their words. Later on in the colonial period and the post-colonial period, they certainly saw a responsibility to speak for nationalist causes, to educate their audience about the kind of interest of the nation and the direction the nation should go, or the kind of social ramifications of policy, the meaning of Marxism, socialism, etc. But yeah, so I think that there's they certainly saw themselves, definitely, if we want to stick with this contrast between how poets understood themselves in general in Western Europe or the United States, there's definitely more of a sense of social responsibility, which is one that, a lot of scholars talk about the idea of commitment, iltizam in Arabic, that comes out of the communist period, right? This concept derived from Jean-Paul Sartre that says the artist or the intellectual, the poet, has to be committed to the cause, and the art itself that's being produced, the poetry, has to be committed to a cause. In my view, this is not a particularly novel phenomenon in Iraq and the Middle East in general. That kind of commitment was always there. There was just a general expectation that your poetry was in the service of broader causes. You don't need kind of Western Marxist philosophers to give you that concept.
So you sort of alluded to the fact that we have this sort of periodization where we have late Ottoman, where they start to see the role as, educating people about whether it's the railways or whatever. And obviously the big moment is in the 1920s as it comes under the British mandate. So how did Iraqi poetry radically change during this period from previous periods?
Great question. So my belief is that the colonial situation fundamentally changed the dynamics of the poem, in particular the function of the praise poem, which had always been an important part of the kind of Arabic poetry tradition. But in the colonial era, things changed dramatically for a few reasons. I mean, the main reason is because all of a sudden, under colonialism, the state is illegitimate, right? So if you're a poet who's expected to offer some praise, are you going to offer praise to the colonial figure? If so, you're going to sort of be seen publicly as a traitor. And so most poets who did praise the colonial state did so under pseudonyms. They did so anonymously, so they wouldn't suffer backlash. But then you start to see, in my view, one of the biggest changes comes under King Faisal with his coronation, because King Faisal really cared about poetry, right? He saw poetry as absolutely essential. And as a newcomer in the Iraqi scene, he really felt that he needed the support of Iraqi poets to give him political legitimacy. So he constantly cultivated the support through patronage, through political connections, etc., of these poets who would be invited to come and read some lines, often in praise of him at various events. But what happens, the phrase I use in the book is that poetry became a sort of double-edged sword. where an Iraqi poet would come and recite a poem of praise, praising Faisal, but he would do it in a kind of dangerous fashion, where on the one hand, you praise Faisal and his family for leading the Arab revolt against the Ottomans, for liberating the Arabs from Turkish despotism, for contributing to the Arab Renaissance, etc., which is all well and good, right? Faisal would have been nodding along to this, but then it starts to get dangerous when the poets would then begin to offer praise for what's to come in the future, right? And they would say things like, and we know that Faisal will continue to lead this glorious cause and to liberate Syria and to fight for the liberation of Palestine and to finish freeing Iraq from the British yoke. And this is where Faisal's in a dilemma, because Faisal, on the one hand, he knows that he's been installed on the throne by Britain. On the other hand, he's frustrated by his British advisors and is trying to walk a delicate tightrope here in terms of having political legitimacy in Iraq and the broader Arab world and in not alienating his British advisors. And the poets are using these public occasions to try and push Faisal in their own direction, in their nationalist direction, which becomes a dangerous game, but it also sets the stage for a kind of public performance of poetry that has this kind of purpose of either gently pushing a particular figure or outright embarrassing him, right? And so poets begin to realize their power, the power of creating a public spectacle that people are then going to talk about. Did you hear what he said in front of Faisal? Did you hear how his face turned red? And that helps the words of the poem to be kind of remembered and memorialized because they're connected to specific events. It's not a kind of abstract poem about power, love, or death, right? It's very much connected to a particular moment in time in history.
I'm wondering if you could give us a particular example of a poet and a poem from this period that sort of illustrates all of this.
Yes, the one that came to mind that I was just thinking of was at Faisal's coronation ceremony, where Rashid al-Hashimi was invited to give a poetic address, and he did so. He gives this talk, first praising Faisal, and then offering this kind of pointed warning almost that we Iraqis have welcomed you because we know what you're going to do, which is to finish the job of liberation. Because obviously, if you didn't do that, you would lose our support, right? So it's this clear threat on this what's supposed to be a memorable, joyous eve for Faisal celebrating his coronation. It's a warning that our loyalty to you is contingent on what you're going to do. And as soon as he could tell, everyone there could tell that Faisal was infuriated by this kind of public embarrassment. And so, the poet Rashid al-Hashimi immediately goes into hiding, and newspapers refuse to publish the state newspapers, that is, refuse to publish the full content of the poem because it's seen as too dangerous in the public eye. But then people remember the poem anyway because it's the Streisand effect, right, in the U.S., where the act of trying to suppress something just furthers the population's curiosity, right? So everyone now hears that the newspapers are censoring it, and it becomes a kind of heroic event. But I can think of a half dozen of these kind of events or occasions in the 1920s, most of them involving Faisal. There's another famous event where Amin al-Rouhani, who is a Lebanese literary figure who came to Iraq and had made some enemies because he'd been quite critical of Iraq, especially of the Shia populations of Iraq. And Muhammad Mati al-Jawahiri gives a speech that's a direct rebuke of Rouhani, reads a poem that's a direct rebuke of Rouhani, and gets the same kind of backlash there.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So thinking about, obviously now it's under British mandate, obviously we mentioned Faisal, but did the British fully appreciate the dangers of poetry, as you put it, in Iraq?
No, I agree that they didn't. They really didn't appreciate the dangers of poetry. I mean, you see fragments of it here and there. I mean, I've seen in the British Archives intelligence reports from 1920 when Britain is very worried about the kind of developing revolutionary movement against them. There's one intelligence report where an Iraqi informant says, "I was at this mosque and this poet stood up and recited this inflammatory poem calling on the people to sacrifice their lives for the sake of the nation. And even me, the informant who's being paid by the colonial state, I was almost moved to join the revolution." And there's like exclamation points hand drawn in the column that the British officer was struck by this kind of danger. But in general, they weren't very cognizant of the dangers of poetry. To me, one of the more striking kind of examples of this is the reality of press censorship in the 1920s. Because what I found in looking at the newspapers and looking at why newspapers got fined or shut down or editors arrested, when newspapers criticized Britain in non-poetry, right, in a normal editorial, that's when the British officers got upset, right? Because British officers are tasked with reading the newspapers every morning. They would find that editorial and they would complain and insist that the Ministry of Interior punish the editor or the whoever wrote the article. But they didn't care about the poetry so much because they couldn't read it. Even someone like Gertrude Bell, who was the most accomplished Arabist of the British officials there, whose Arabic skills were the best. I've found numerous letters in which she's talking about a big event and some poet got up to read it, and she's writing to her father and she's like, the words were beautiful, I didn't understand any of it. So she understands Arabic, but she couldn't understand poetry, certainly written. She had, I think, a Sudanese assistant who obviously native Arabic speaker, and he would tell her for some reason he was not particularly struck by poetry, and he would say, oh, it's just it's not really useful. So essentially, the British Ministry of Interior officers were not reading the poems that came out in newspapers. They were only reading the editorials. I think when they did read the poems, they're just kind of scanning the title and looking for keywords. Do they say something about England here? And so if you have even the loosest metaphors, even if all Iraqis understand you're talking about Britain, it goes over the head of the British officers. Now, for the Iraqis working in the Ministry of Interior, on the other hand, the situation is reversed. They didn't seem to care so much about whether an editorial is slightly critical of the Iraqi state, because they figure, like, does anyone really care about editorials? But the poems are often on the front page of the newspapers, right? The poem is often the selling point of the newspaper. It's what, if you imagine how newspapers would be kind of consumed by larger audiences in Iraq, it's likely to be at a coffee shop where someone might read things aloud, and they're going to read aloud the poems. That's what people want to hear. And so if a poem was critical of a particular Iraqi figure, that's when kind of consequences were levied out against the newspapers, the editors, and the poets themselves. So you see a sort of dichotomy here where the British only cared about the editorials, the Iraqis cared mostly about the poems.
It's interesting because there's a kind of Eurocentrism into how the British suppressed, isn't there?
Yes, for sure. Right.
And I think actually one of the more interesting aspects was the Gertrude Bell thing you highlighted, because I think, like all of us, we've just been told, she was a great Arabist. She spoke Arabic. She was, as near native as you can be. And to hear that she didn't understand the poetry does make you wonder about who was actually assessing her.
Right. Absolutely. Yes.
But the British do something. I mean, because obviously they do arrange cultural visits from their other colony, India.
Yes.
And you actually, and I thought this was very surprising. I didn't hear about this episode until I read your book, which is Tagore, who's obviously a very famous Bengal language poet, considered a polymath, a big figure, a cultural and intellectual icon in that part of India. What's he doing in Baghdad? What's happening here?
Well, so Tagore's visit to Baghdad, I believe, comes in December of 1932. So it was just after independence. Obviously, Britain still has a strong presence in Iraq because the kind of pivot from the mandate to independence is very much stage managed, and the British advisors are still there. There's a treaty put in place. But the visit itself, I think, is more of the initiative of Faisal than his British advisors. Because again, Faisal really cared about poetry. He cared about this sort of cultural phenomenon. And he cared a lot about Tagore. I think in a lot of ways, Tagore fit Faisal's kind of purpose. Faisal, obviously he's an Arab, he's a Muslim, he's Sunni Muslim, but he's very sort of cognizant of the internal dynamics in Iraq. He's cognizant of his need to appeal to the Shia majority population. He wants to make sure that he also has the loyalty of Kurds and Turkmen and Jews and Christians in Iraq. And so he's interested in cultivating this kind of cosmopolitan, tolerant environment. But at the same time, he's aware of the fact that he owes his position ultimately to Britain. And so, he wants to, at the same time, not his ideology, he doesn't want his ideology to be so cosmopolitan and tolerant that that's sort of confused with embracing European secularism or something like that. And so he sees a lot of advantage in promoting a kind of cosmopolitan Eastern spirit, right? This idea that there's this kind of spiritual awakening movement that's going to sort of combine modernity and science and new achievements with this kind of cultural authenticity that's somehow distinctive of the East, in distinction to the West. And Tagore really symbolizes that in a lot of ways for Faisal, right? There's an advantage in bringing in this Indian figure who's been critical of British colonialism in India, who's not a Muslim, but still, stands in brotherhood with Muslims in India and elsewhere. And so Faisal invites him. He comes to visit. Tagore has a kind of kindred spirit in Jamil Sidki Zahawi, a prominent Iraqi poet from the late Ottoman era, who's still alive in the 30s, who's in a lot of ways, I think, saw himself as a Tagore-like figure in Iraq. Even cultivated the same kind of physical appearance, I would say.
Was Tagore ever translated into Arabic at that point that you know of?
Not that I know of. I'm trying to think. I've seen poems praising him in Arabic even before the visit, but I don't think I recall seeing any of his work translated into Arabic. Although I won't swear by that.
And what actually happens on this visit? Because you write about an episode where he's a guest of honor at a dinner, and there's lots of different Iraqi poets there. What actually happens here?
So Tagore gives a speech, reads a poem praising Faisal. It's a poem kind of in praise of tolerance and cosmopolitanism, of everything that Faisal is trying to do in Iraq. Zahawi, the admirer of Tagore, who I mentioned, recites a poem praising Tagore for all of these reasons as well. But then another Iraqi poet stands up, Muhammad Bashat al-Athari, who had more of a nationalist line. And he was put off by Tagore's kind of praise for this, for tolerance and harmony between nations, and for Zahawi's indication of that as well. In his views, Zahawi, I should mention, had a kind of complex and contentious reputation because he had been seen as close to the British state for certain periods of time. At other periods of time, he was kind of out of league with the British. But that connection between Zahawi and Britain was still there. Now Zahawi is linked to Tagore. And even though Tagore was critical of colonialism, the kind of appeal to a brotherhood between nations struck a chord among some of the Iraqi nationalist writers who thought, like, well, what exactly do you mean by harmony between nations, between all nations? Does that mean we're supposed to sort of forgive Britain for everything? Are we now criticizing the revolutionaries, rebels, whatever you want to call them, who fought against Britain? Is an attack? Is it a kind of a commitment to nonviolence that becomes an attack on the nationalist movement? And so Authorey got up and read a poem that was supposed to be praising Tagore, but ended up being very critical of this call for communal harmony. Because, Authorey was perceiving the call for community harmony as a kind of rebuke of anti-colonialism. And Tagore didn't know Arabic, so Authorey reads this speech. It's, sounds like it's a poem of praise, and so he clapped along with everyone else. But there's the kind of the simmering embarrassment from Zahawi as he's watching, because obviously the Iraqis know Faisal's embarrassed because everyone knows what is said, but it's a kind of echo of what happened in front of a lot of British diplomats earlier, where you hear the kind of musical rhythm of the poem, but you have no idea what's being said. And you just assume it must be nice because that's what you're supposed to do on an occasion like this. But in fact, Iraqi poets over the past decade had kind of perfected this art of taking these occasions and using the opportunity to, exact their revenge or to inflict embarrassment to make their message heard somehow.
Did Tagore never realize that this was what was happening?
No, as far as I know, he did not. Right, and that particular incident. I think Faisal and others, how we decided that it's just best if we sort of pretend it didn't happen. Right, no need to embarrass the guest.
I feel like there could be like an entire comedy show just based around this topic.
Yes, for sure. Right.
So, moving forward then, what has happened to Iraq's revolutionary tradition of poetry, in a sense? I mean, obviously, since then, you've had numerous regimes. You had the Ba'ath Party, you had Saddam, you had 2003 invasion, and now you have what we have. So what happened to it along the way?
So my argument is that, certainly there's still a vibrant tradition of Iraqi poetry. There's still kind of radical revolutionary messages being articulated by poets. But my argument is that the kind of radical rebel poetry, revolutionary poetry that I'm talking about in the book really is limited to a particular moment in time. I think you can see echoes of this certainly in the Arabic poetry tradition in certain other contexts. The one that comes to mind the most strongly is Palestine. Maha Nasser has written about this in her brilliant book Brothers Apart, especially of the Palestinian poets like Sami al-Qasim and Mahmoud Darwish, who became citizens of Israel and then also used kind of Arabic verse as a way to undercut the Israeli authorities in the 1960s and beyond. But in Iraq, I think that the role of poetry and its ability to function as this kind of dissident language of social protest in public really begins to change and really changes in fundamental ways in the early 1960s. And I think it happens for a couple of reasons. The first is that the political dynamics change. I don't want to undercut the reality of censorship and oppression under the British Mandate and then later under the Hashemite monarchy, because dissident poets were punished, arrested, imprisoned, exiled in certain cases. But I describe their kind of game, their practice of poetry in this period as a kind of dangerous game, because it's a game in which there's a line drawn by the state that, like, you can go up to this line, just don't cross it. And the game is, okay, what if I put my foot on the line, right? What if my criticism of the state goes right up until that line, but no further? And then what if I just go a few inches beyond it, right? So there's an expectation that, like, you can get away with a little bit of criticism, just don't go too far. I think certainly under the Ba'athist regime, the repressive nature of the state intensifies to the extent that you can't play games anymore, right? It wouldn't be tolerated. And so most of the kind of leading poets from this from the certainly the era of the 1958 revolution and the early 1960s, they're all exiled after 63. So poetry no longer becomes something that can be done in public as this kind of rebuke to the state for political reasons. The other major development, I think, is aesthetic. I think you see a major shift when you see this kind of aesthetic shift from neoclassical poetry to free verse poetry. And I always have to be careful about how I frame this, because I'm always worried about sounding like stodgy or conservative. Personally, my own taste in English language culture, I mean, I tend to like kind of experimental and avant-garde things, and I'm very much not sort of committed to classical music and Shakespeare and Emily Dickinson and those kind of poets and writers. So I don't want to be critical. I actually really enjoy free verse poetry in Arabic. A lot of the pioneers of this form of poetry were Iraqis, like Badr Shakir al-Sayyed, Nazak al-Malaka, and others. But it does, I think, have ramifications for the ability of poetry to function in this kind of public environment, because there's something about neoclassical poetry, the kind of straight meter and rhyme of it, that's conducive to a public reading. It's conducive to chanting in the streets. It's conducive to someone standing at a podium while the crowd raises their fists in the air and chants alongside it, right? It roils the emotions in that way. Whereas free verse poetry, it can still certainly be an oral tradition, but it tends to be read a little bit more. So it's more about what journals it's printed in, the kind of book publications. It becomes a slightly more private affair, or when it is read aloud, it's not, you imagine like a quieter coffee house, right? Rather than people chanting and yelling alongside it. And so in this shift from neoclassical poetry to free verse poetry, I think you start to see poets, no matter how radical or revolutionary their ideologies and ideas, I think you start to see poets functioning more like intellectuals rather than these figures that can kind of totally transverse the divide between high culture and mass culture. It becomes more, I mean, there's still in the free verse era, poetry is far more important in Iraq and has far more resonance among broad social classes than poetry does in the US, for example. But I think you see a shift in that direction in comparison to the way that poetry functioned, especially in public spaces and public settings in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s.
And even now, it's still very popular. I mean, it's still very much tied to politics. I mean, obviously, in your book, you go with that example of the young poet in, I think it was in Karbala or Najaf?
In Najaf.
The Najaf, a really like traditional Shi'i city, and he's reciting a communist poem. But of course, across Iraq, you will find people, various political factions even having their own poets as well. That's still a thing.
Yes, right, for sure. And there were, there were certainly still, poetry continued to play a really important role even in the Ba'athist era and the era of Saddam Hussein. But it was no longer used in a dissident manner, right? I personally, I don't have interest in writing about that era of Iraqi poetry, partly because I find the kind of Ba'athist poetry a little bit stilted. It's a little bit boring. It's really not very pretty. But also the idea of a praise poem written from a previous era, in general, people don't want to read that, right? People in the contemporary moment don't want to, like, why do we want to read someone praising some figure from 50 years ago or 70 years ago? To me, it's really only interesting if that praise is kind of couched in this kind of double-edged language. And it reminds me of episodes from kind of the classical Arabic medieval tradition, Mutanabbi and others, who use their kind of praise poems as a way of kind of articulating their own greatness or offering a kind of veiled warning or threat to the leaders they were ostensibly praising. So that tradition always existed, but like when you get to a more authoritarian regime, that kind of praise poem loses some of the more interesting aspects of the kind of performance itself, in my view.
But I would imagine it changed a lot after 2003.
Yeah, I mean, it does. Certainly, it's not as dangerous anymore. To my knowledge, I have seen less effort of, you have the same, after 2003, you would have the same kind of basic dynamic as you had in the British Mandate, right? Where now the Americans are standing in the place of the Brits, and the kind of earliest Iraqi political leaders from 2004 onwards would kind of be tarred with the same kind of hint of collaboration as Prince Faisal were, right? They had to walk the kind of tightrope of not alienating the American occupation authorities, but also not alienating their publics either. But I certainly don't see, I don't think that the Iraqi politicians, the Iraqi state in the early 2000s saw poetry as something that was as essential to their political legitimacy as, say, Faisal did in the 1920s. So you don't see poetry kind of mobilized and marshaled in the same way. And I think also just the intervening decades transform the social status of the poet. I mean, really, like in the 1920s, the prominent poets were also often leading religious scholars. They were politicians. They were sort of men of many talents, and the kind of pinnacle of political and social elites. They just also had mass followings and mass audiences as well. But the nature of poetry has changed by the time we get to the 2000s, and a dissident poet is not going to have that kind of high political or social status anymore. And so even as they're critical of the state, they lack the kind of they lack the status to really kind of exploit that dual nature of being both well-connected and that kind of prominent political dissidents. And so it's harder to sort of find the public opportunity to make their mark, right? To bury the knife in someone's back through their words.
Okay, so obviously since you've done this research, I'm sort of now wondering, particularly in the West, now that you're sort of opening historians' eyes to the potentiality of studying what poetry can tell us about history in this region and possibly in others as well. So what does, studies now look like? What research is going on around you? Are people now really taking this up as a subject to study?
I've seen a number of works recently that use poetry in really interesting ways as a kind of window in history. I certainly would not, in many of these cases, it's me taking inspiration from them rather than vice versa. I mentioned before Maha Nasser, whose work on poetry in Palestine, especially among Palestinian citizens of Israel, was hugely influential for me, and has, I think, I've tried to do similar things in writing about the use of poetry in Iraq. So you do see, I have seen some more openness to using poetry as this window. I could also mention a number of scholars who have done similar things with poetry in Egypt. But there's kind of different contexts for these various things. In Egypt, for example, you had a much more vibrant scene in colloquial poetry from a much earlier date. And so in Egypt in the early 20th centuries, you do see more of a divide between the high culture of neoclassical poetry and the kind of mass culture of colloquial poetry. But I've seen a number of interesting works by Ziad Fahmy and others using colloquial poetry as a historical source about what mass audiences are thinking and talking about, how they're conceiving the nation, how they're talking about colonialism, et cetera. But also, I think there's I wouldn't say it's gone all the way. I mean, I still find myself talking to a number of scholars a lot who will say, I'm a little embarrassed, but like when I read a book in Arabic, and the author, cites some line of poetry to make his case, I just skip over the poetry, right? Because there's a sense of like, it often seems frivolous, or like window dressing. But I think in the original Arabic, like often the poetry is the key, right? It's there to sort of make the claim, and it's not just kind of window dressing to a point being made otherwise. So there is a sense that, it takes a little bit more work. Historians are working through, tons of sources, and sometimes it is easy to just kind of gloss over and not read the poetry there. I mean, to me, I still find, when I was writing this book and first pitching my talks at conferences and starting to pitch the idea of the book to various to editors and to book presses, I always had this kind of sense of frustration because I'd mention the topic or the title, and often the response was, so you should be in literary studies, right? You should talk to this person, right? I deal more with history. And I'm a historian, right? My PhD is in history. I teach in history. I do work now that's not using poetry. But so my point was that poetry can be a historical source and can provide this kind of historical window to this moment in time. But sometimes it's very difficult to break through the kind of categories that we have in the West, where poetry is literature, and that's something different, fundamentally different from the kind of sources we use for history. So I still have some frustration with the inability to sort of open our minds to think about the kind of the weakness of some of these categories, and the fact that they might be drawn or might be kind of conceived in a Eurocentric fashion and might not function the same way in all places and time. On the other hand, there has been a lot of exciting attempts from a number of historians to use poetry in these ways.
Yeah, it might be an interesting thing as well when you're like at dinner parties and you've mentioned that you've done poetry. They start asking you to recite poems. Go, no, I'm a historian, not a literary guy.
Right. Yes, exactly. Right. I mean, and it's a little bit embarrassing for me too, because I don't dislike poetry, but I was never, before this book, I was never saw myself as like I would never describe my primary cultural interest as poetry. I wasn't a great kind of aficionado of poetry in English. So like, I was drawn to poetry because of its utility as a historical source. That's not to say I don't like it. I did end up loving a lot of the poetry that I went through. But it's not, I'm not coming at it from an aesthetic angle where my main concern is the beauty of the line or the verses.
Kevin Jones, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed it.
And for our audience, thank you for tuning in. Please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.